Will's boots crunched through the snow as he pulled himself away from the wreck. The ship was gone. Not gone like disappeared. Gone like destroyed. The front half was buried nose first into the mountainside. The back half was scattered across the slope in burning pieces. Black smoke was rising into the pale sky, but the wind was already pulling it apart. Nobody would see it from far away. Nobody would know where he came down. Will stood in the snow and stared at what was left of his ship. He had 43 survey flights before this one. 43 times he had gone up, done his job and come back down safely. Some flights had been boring. Some had been a little rough. But none of them had ever ended like this. He checked his radio first. He already knew it was broken. He had tried it 3 times on the way down, right before the ship hit the slope. Static each time. But he tried it again anyway because that is what people do when they are scared and need something to do with their hands. Static. He turned it off and put it in his pocket. His emergency beacon was next. He pulled it from his vest and pressed the button. The small light on the side blinked twice. Then it stopped. He pressed the button again. Nothing. He turned it over and saw the crack running along the back panel. The impact had broken it clean through. He put it in his pocket too, even though it was useless. He did not know why. He just felt wrong to throw it away. Will looked around at the mountain. It was enormous. White and gray and completely silent except for the wind. The kind of silence that feels heavy like the mountain is listening. The sky above was pale blue and cloudless, but the air was sharp and mean. His breath came out in thick white clouds. His fingers were already starting to go stiff inside his gloves. He did a quick check of what he had. His jacket was thick but not made for mountain survival. His boots were good. He had a small bag that had been strapped under his seat, and it had survived the crash. Inside were 3 energy bars, a folding knife, a small flashlight, a thin emergency blanket and a box of matches. Not much. Enough to keep him thinking for a while, but not enough to keep him alive for long if he stayed still. He needed to move. Will looked up the slope. High ground was better. From up there he might be able to see a valley, a river, anything that told him which direction to walk. Staying near the crash site made sense if rescue was coming soon, but rescue was not coming soon. Nobody knew exactly where he had gone down. His last position report had been 2 hours before the crash, and he had drifted far off course during the storm that had come out of nowhere and swallowed his ship like it was nothing. He started climbing. The snow was deep in some places and hard-packed in others. His boots punched through the crust with each step and he had to pull his leg free every time. It was slow and heavy work. His thighs started burning after 10 minutes. His lungs started burning after 20. The cold air cut the inside of his chest like something sharp every time he breathed in too fast. He stopped to rest against a large gray rock. From here he could see the crash site below him. The fires were smaller now. The wind was doing its work. In another hour there would be nothing left to see from the air. He was going to become a missing survey pilot on a planet that nobody visited very often. The kind of case that gets a file and a sad note and not much else. Will pushed that thought away. He ate half of 1 energy bar and drank a small amount of water from the bottle in his bag. He allowed himself exactly 2 minutes of rest. Then he stood up and kept climbing. The slope got steeper as he went higher. The rocks became bigger and more jagged. He had to use his hands in some places, grabbing at stone edges and pulling himself up. His gloves were getting torn at the fingertips. He could feel the cold reaching his skin through the holes. He had been climbing for almost 2 hours when the light started to change. The pale blue sky above him was going darker. Not night. Not yet. But the sun, whatever passed for a sun on this world, was dropping toward the western peaks. He had maybe 3 hours of light left. Maybe less. He needed to find shelter before dark. A man without shelter on a mountain like this, at night, with temperatures that were already dropping fast, would not last until morning. Will knew this the way he knew his own name. Not with fear. Just with clear, flat certainty. It was a fact like the weight of the bag on his back or the pain in his knees. Find shelter. That was the next job. He pulled himself up over a wide flat rock and stopped to scan the slope above him. There were dark shapes up ahead. Maybe caves. Maybe just shadows in the rock face. Hard to tell from here. He picked the largest dark shape and aimed for it. He was halfway there when he heard it. He stopped walking. He stood completely still and listened. The wind moved across the slope. The snow creaked under his weight. Far away something cracked, maybe ice, maybe rock. And then, under all of it, small and thin and almost not there at all, he heard a sound. It was hard to describe. Not quite a cry. Not quite a call. Something between the two. High and soft and very, very tired. The sound of something that had been making noise for a long time and was starting to run out of strength. Will turned his head slowly, trying to find the direction. There. To his left. Higher up the slope. Behind a cluster of large flat rocks about 50 meters above him. He stood there for a moment. He was cold. He was tired. His fingers were going numb and his knees hurt, and he had 3 hours of light left to find shelter before the mountain killed him. Going 50 meters in the wrong direction, uphill, through deep snow, was not a smart thing to do. He looked toward the dark shapes that might be caves. Then he looked toward the rocks where the sound was coming from. The sound came again. Thinner this time. More tired. Will adjusted the bag on his back and turned left. He climbed toward the sound. It took him almost 20 minutes to cover the 50 meters. The snow was deeper on this part of the slope and the rocks were awkward to climb around. He slipped twice and caught himself both times with his hands, tearing his gloves further. The cold reached his fingertips fully now. He could barely feel them. But the sound was getting clearer as he climbed. He pulled himself up onto the last flat rock and stopped. Behind it, tucked into a shallow hollow where 2 large stones came together, was an egg. Will stared at it. It was about the size of a large watermelon. The shell was dark green, almost black in the fading light, with thin gold lines running across the surface like veins or like cracks that had been filled with something that glowed. It was sitting in the ruins of what had been a nest. Broken sticks. Dark feathers or something like feathers. Torn pieces of something soft and animal warm, now cold and scattered. Something had destroyed the nest. The claw marks on the rock around it were deep and wide and very fresh. Whatever had made this nest was gone. And the egg was alone. Will crouched down and held his torn glove near the shell without touching it. He could feel the warmth from a hand's distance away. The gold lines pulsed very slightly. Slow and faint like breathing. The sound came again from inside the egg, and this time Will was close enough to hear it clearly. It was not a cry for food or a signal to a parent. It was something simpler and older than that. It was the sound of something small and warm and alive, alone in the cold, not understanding why no one had come. Will sat back on his heels and looked at the egg for a long moment. Then he took off his outer jacket. The cold hit him like a wall. He worked fast, wrapping the jacket around the egg carefully, tucking the arms underneath so nothing could fall open. He lifted it. It was heavier than it looked. Warm and solid against his chest. He held it with both arms and stood up. The dark shapes that might be caves were still up ahead. Will looked at them, then looked down at the egg in his arms. "Okay," he said quietly to no one. "First things first." He started climbing again. Will held the egg tight against his chest and kept moving. The cold was worse now without his outer jacket. The wind came across the slope in long steady pushes, cutting straight through his thin inner layer. His shoulders were already shaking. His breath came fast and shallow. But the egg was warm against him, genuinely warm, like holding something alive and working hard to stay that way, and he focused on that warmth instead of the cold eating at his back. He had maybe 2 hours of light left. Possibly less. The dark shapes in the rock face above him were closer now. He could see them more clearly as he climbed. 2 of them were just shadows, shallow dips in the stone that would give him no protection at all. But the third one, the largest one on the right side, looked deeper. Darker. The kind of dark that meant actual depth, actual walls, actual shelter from the wind. He aimed for it and kept climbing. The egg shifted in his arms. Will tightened his grip instinctively. He looked down at it. The gold lines across the dark green shell were definitely brighter than before. Not much, but noticeably. Like something inside had turned up a lamp by 1 small degree. And the shaking was different too. Before, when he had first found it, the movement had been random and weak. Small trembles going in no particular direction. Now the movement had a pattern. A push from the inside. Deliberate. Repeated. Something pressing against the shell and then stopping and then pressing again. Something was trying to get out. Not in a frantic way. More like someone knocking on a door. Patient but persistent. Trying to find the weak point. Will kept walking. He talked to the egg as he climbed, because the silence of the mountain was starting to press on him in a way he did not like, and talking made him feel less alone. He kept his voice low and even, the way you talk when you do not want to startle something. He told the egg that they were going to find a cave. He told it the cave was going to be dry and out of the wind and that he was going to get a fire going. He told it that fires were a human thing, something his kind had been doing for thousands of years, and that they were very good at it. He was not sure if any of that was true on a mountain he had never been on before with wood that might not burn the way he expected, but he said it anyway. The egg pulsed once, warm and steady against his chest. Will decided to take that as agreement. The cave entrance was narrower than it had looked from below. He had to turn sideways to get through the opening, holding the egg out in front of him with both hands so it did not scrape against the rock. Inside it opened up wider. The ceiling was high enough to stand under. The floor was flat stone, cold but dry. No wind. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. Less heavy. More like rest. Will stood in the entrance and let his eyes adjust. The cave went back about 10 meters. Deep enough. The walls were solid. No cracks big enough for the wind to push through. Near the back there was a shallow pit in the floor, natural, like the rock had settled and left a bowl shape. It was a good place for a fire. The smoke would find its way out through the narrow entrance rather than filling the space. He set the egg down carefully in the middle of the cave floor. He did not want to put it on the cold stone. He looked in his bag and found the emergency blanket, thin silver material that folded down to almost nothing. He spread it out and set the egg on top of it. The gold lines pulsed twice when it touched the blanket. Brighter this time. Will watched it for a moment, then turned to deal with the fire. He went back outside. The light was going fast now. He moved quickly along the slope below the cave looking for wood. On a frozen mountain he had not expected to find much, but the slope below the cave had several dead and twisted trees growing sideways out of the rock, stunted things that had given up growing tall a long time ago. Their branches were thin but dry. The trunks near the base were thicker. He broke off what he could carry and made 2 trips back to the cave. The matches were in the small box at the bottom of his bag. He had 12 of them. He built the fire carefully in the shallow pit, the way he had been taught a long time ago by a man who took things like fire building seriously. Thin dry material first. Then small sticks crossed over it. Then the thicker pieces on top. He took his time even though his fingers were clumsy with cold. A fire built badly was worse than no fire at all because it used your matches and gave you nothing. He struck the first match. Caught. He held it to the thin dry material at the base and watched the flame take hold. It spread slowly then faster as the small sticks caught. Then the thicker pieces began to glow at the edges. He fed it carefully, one piece at a time, until he had something steady and real burning in the pit. The heat hit his face and he closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he picked up the egg and moved it closer to the fire. Not too close. He held his hand at the distance he was going to place it and counted to 10, checking the heat level. Warm but not dangerous. He set the egg down with the emergency blanket under it and sat behind it, so his body blocked the cold air coming from the cave entrance. The egg was between him and the fire. He was between the egg and the cold. He sat like that for a while, feeding the fire when it needed it, watching the gold lines on the egg do their slow, steady pulse. Outside the wind had picked up. He could hear it moving across the mountain, a long low sound that rose and fell. Inside the cave it was still. The fire made small sounds. The egg was warm. Will ate the rest of the first energy bar and drank a little more water. He thought about his situation in a steady and practical way, because falling apart was not useful and he had never been good at it anyway. Rescue was unlikely before morning. Possibly unlikely for 2 or 3 days. He had 2 energy bars left. He had water but not enough for more than a day. The fire would need more wood by morning, which meant going back out in the dark or the early cold to get it. These were problems but they were manageable problems. He had shelter. He had heat. He was alive. The egg rocked. Will looked down at it. It rocked again. A full movement this time, shifting to one side and then back. The gold lines flared briefly, brighter than they had been all day, then settled back to their slow pulse. From inside came that sound again. The one he had heard on the slope. But closer now and stronger. Not the tired thin sound of before. Something more awake. More present. Something that knew the cold was gone. Will leaned forward slightly and looked at the shell. There was a mark near the top that had not been there before. A small dent, pushing outward from the inside. Like something had pressed very hard against that one spot. He watched it. After about a minute it happened again. A push. The shell flexed slightly, not enough to crack, but enough to show that whatever was inside was strong and getting stronger now that it was warm. Will sat back. He thought about the destroyed nest. The deep claw marks in the rock. Whatever had done that had been large. Whatever had built the nest in the first place had also been large. He was sitting in a cave on an unknown mountain holding the egg of something he had no information about at all, keeping it warm with a fire, watching it try to hatch. Any reasonable person would call this a bad idea. Will fed another stick to the fire. The egg rocked again and the sound from inside came again and Will felt something move in his chest that was not fear and not cold. It was something quieter than both of those things. He did not have a word for it exactly. The closest he could get was this. He was not going to let anything happen to this egg. Not the cold. Not the mountain. Not whatever had torn apart the nest. Nothing. He pulled his bag closer, settled his back against the cave wall and kept watch. The fire burned. The gold lines pulsed. Outside, the wind moved across the mountain like something searching. Inside the cave it was warm and still and safe. Will was almost asleep when the cave went dark. Not the slow dark of a fire dying down. The sudden dark of something large blocking the entrance. His eyes opened fast and his hand found the folding knife in his pocket before his brain had fully caught up with what was happening. He sat up straight and looked toward the cave entrance. It was filled. Completely filled. Wall to wall and floor to ceiling. Something stood there that was so large it blocked every bit of the outside night sky. Will could not see stars anymore. He could not see the snow on the slope outside. He could not see anything beyond the entrance except the shape of something enormous and the 2 points of light that were its eyes. They were amber. Bright and deep, like fire seen through old glass. They did not blink. Will did not move. His brain was doing several things at once. It was telling him to run, which was not possible. It was telling him to shout, which was not useful. It was telling him that the knife in his hand was about as helpful as a toothpick against whatever was standing in that entrance, which was entirely accurate. He put the knife down slowly. The eyes moved. Not the whole head. Just the eyes, dropping down from Will's face to the egg sitting between him and the fire on the silver emergency blanket. They stayed there for a long moment. Something changed in the quality of the silence in the cave. Will could not explain it. It was like the air got heavier. Then the eyes came back up to his face. Will's heart was hitting the inside of his chest very hard. He could feel it in his throat. But he kept his face as still as he could and his breathing as steady as he could manage, because something in the back of his mind was telling him very clearly that panic was the wrong move here. That stillness was the only thing he had going for him right now. The creature at the entrance made a sound. It was low and deep and Will felt it in his chest more than he heard it with his ears. It was not a roar. It was not a growl. It was something more like a word in a language built from stone and thunder. A single sound that carried weight and intention and a kind of grief that Will recognized even though he had never heard it from anything like this before. It was looking for its egg. It had been looking for a long time. Will understood this without being told. He understood it the way you understand rain before it hits you. The feeling came first and the words came after. He looked at the egg. The gold lines were blazing now, brighter than they had been at any point since he found it. The egg was rocking steadily back and forth and the sound from inside had changed completely. It was not the tired searching sound from before. It was urgent and sharp and getting louder. New. Whatever was inside that shell knew that the large presence at the cave entrance was there. Will looked back at the creature. He needed to do something. Sitting still was fine for the first moment, but the first moment was passing. The creature had not moved into the cave, but it had not moved away either. It was waiting. For what, Will did not know. But waiting meant it was thinking, and thinking meant there was a chance. He moved slowly. He kept his hands visible at all times. He shifted from sitting against the wall to kneeling on the cave floor, lowering himself so he was not standing, not threatening, just smaller. He reached out and picked up the egg with both hands. It was warm. It rocked once in his grip, that strong, deliberate push from inside pressing against his palms. He held it out. Both arms extended, the egg resting in his open hands, offered completely. His arms were already tired from the climbing and his muscles shook slightly with the effort of holding the position, but he held it. I found it alone, Will said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. Quiet. Level. He kept his eyes on the creature's face, not challenging, just present, just honest. The nest was destroyed. It was cold. I could hear it. He paused. I only kept it warm. That is all I did. The creature did not move. The amber eyes stayed on him. Not on the egg this time. On his face. On his eyes. Will had the very strange and very strong feeling that he was being read. Not his words. Those had probably meant nothing, sounds in a language that meant nothing to this creature. But something else was being read. Something underneath the words. His hands were shaking now. Not from fear alone. From cold and exhaustion and the weight of holding his arms out for so long. But he did not lower them. The fire crackled behind him. A small piece of wood shifted and sent a brief shower of sparks up toward the cave ceiling. Neither Will nor the creature at the entrance looked away from each other. The egg rocked hard in Will's hands. The gold lines flared white for just a moment, then settled back to gold. The sound from inside was continuous now, a steady urgent pulse of something that wanted very badly to be on the other side of the shell. The creature made another sound. This one was different. Softer. Still deep, still chest-filling, but the weight in it had changed. The grief was still there, but something else had moved into it. Something that Will again recognized without being able to fully explain. It was the sound of something that had been afraid and was now, very carefully, beginning to not be afraid. Will kept his arms out. His shoulders were burning. His knees hurt against the stone floor. A small voice in the back of his head was doing calculations about how much longer he could hold this position, and the answer was not very long. Then the creature moved. Will's breath stopped. But it did not come forward into the cave. It moved sideways. One slow step to the left, massive and deliberate, pulling its body away from the direct center of the entrance. The movement was controlled and careful, like something that knew its own size and was choosing very precisely how to use it. A gap opened on the right side of the cave entrance. Not a large gap, but real. Wide enough for a person to walk through if they went at an angle. Wide enough to mean something. Will looked at the gap. He understood immediately what it meant. It was not an accident. It was not the creature shifting its weight. It was a deliberate choice and a deliberate message. The entrance was no longer fully blocked. Will could leave if he wanted to. He could put the egg down and walk through that gap and out into the night, and the creature would not stop him. It was offering him a choice. Will looked at the gap for a moment. Then he looked outside through it. The mountain at night was black and white and brutal. The wind was moving hard across the slope, picking up loose snow and throwing it sideways. The temperature out there was well below what a person in a torn inner layer with no outer jacket could survive for long. Walking out into that was not surviving. It was just dying in a different place. But Will did not think about the cold when he looked at the gap. He thought about the fact that the creature had opened it. Something that large, that powerful, that clearly capable of filling the entrance completely and leaving no gap at all, had chosen to step aside. Had chosen to give Will a way out. Had looked at his face and his shaking arms and the egg in his outstretched hands and made a decision. Will lowered his arms slowly. He held the egg against his chest again. Then he moved to the side of the fire that was further from the entrance and sat back down against the cave wall. He set the egg on the blanket between himself and the fire, the same position as before. He looked at the creature. Was watching him. Still and enormous in the entrance, the amber eyes steady and unblinking. Will met its gaze and stayed where he was. For a long moment nothing moved. Then the creature lowered itself. Slowly, with the heavy deliberate grace of something very large that was choosing to make itself smaller. It settled into the entrance of the cave, body filling the space, head lowering until it rested near the floor. Not inside the cave. Still in the entrance. But no longer filling it like a wall. More like a door that had decided to stay. The amber eyes stayed on Will for a while longer. Then they moved to the egg. Something in the creature's face changed. Something that Will had no word for but did not need one. He had seen that look before, on different faces in different places. It was the look of something that had been terrified of losing what it loved most and had just found it again. Will looked at the fire and fed it another piece of wood. He did not look back at the entrance. He did not need to watch. He just listened to the wind outside and the fire inside and the steady pulse of something alive and warm between them. The cave was quiet. And in the quiet, something had shifted. The fire burned low between them. Will added another piece of wood and watched the flames take it. The wood caught slowly, the edges going orange first, then the rest following. Heat pushed back against the cold that came in around the creature's body at the cave entrance. It was not a perfect arrangement. The cave was not fully warm. But it was survivable, and survivable was enough. He did not look at the entrance directly. He looked at the fire. But he was aware of the entrance the way you are aware of a sound just outside your hearing. A constant presence at the edge of attention. The amber eyes had not moved since the creature settled. Will could feel them on him the way you feel sunlight on your skin, not uncomfortable, just present and real and impossible to ignore completely. The egg sat between him and the fire on the silver blanket. It was still rocking. Slower now than before, but steady. The gold lines pulsed with a rhythm that Will had started thinking of as breathing, even though he knew it was not exactly that. It was just the closest word he had. Something alive doing the work of staying alive. An hour passed. Will fed the fire again and shifted his position against the wall. His back was stiff. His knees ached. The cold from the stone floor came up through his legs no matter how he sat. He pulled his bag under him as a thin barrier between himself and the ground, and that helped a little. He thought about eating one of his 2 remaining energy bars. He decided against it. Not yet. He did not know how long he needed to make them last. He looked at the egg instead and thought about something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since he found it. The destroyed nest. The deep claw marks in the rock around it. Those marks had been fresh. Made recently. And they were large as the creature now sitting in the entrance of his cave. But the creature had come looking for the egg with grief and urgency, not with the careless energy of something that had just wrecked a nest and walked away. So whatever had destroyed the nest was not the mother. Something else had done that. Something that had come to the nest and caused enough damage to scatter everything, and the mother had come back to find her nest gone and her egg missing. Will thought about that for a while. He thought about what it would feel like to come back and find something you loved was gone. To search a frozen mountain in the dark with no idea if you were going to find anything at all. He looked toward the entrance. The amber eyes were still on him. Will spoke quietly. Not because he expected to be understood. Just because the silence had been sitting between them for a long time and he wanted to put something in it. Something else did that, he said. To the nest. That was not me. He held the creature's gaze as he said it. The amber eyes did not change. No sign of understanding, no reaction he could read clearly. But the creature did not look away either. It stayed exactly as it was, head low, body filling the entrance, watching him with that steady, careful attention. Will looked back at the fire. Another hour passed. The wind outside was stronger now. Will could hear it clearly, a long continuous sound that rose and fell like something breathing. Occasionally a gust came hard enough to push cold air into the cave around the creature's body, and the fire flickered and leaned sideways before settling again. Each time it happened, Will watched the fire carefully until it steadied. Losing the fire was not something he wanted to think about. He got up once to get more wood from the pile he had stacked against the cave wall. He moved slowly and kept his movements visible, no sudden actions, nothing that could be read as a threat. He picked up 3 pieces of wood and came back to his spot and sat down again. The amber eyes tracked him the entire time, following every step with that same quiet, careful attention. Will noticed something as he sat back down. The creature's head had moved. Not much. A few degrees to the left. It was now angled slightly differently than before, no longer looking directly at Will's face but at something lower. Will followed the direction of its gaze and realized it was looking at his hands. Specifically at the way he had just set the wood down carefully rather than dropping it, at the way his hands moved around the egg without touching it as he settled back into position. It was watching how he treated the egg. Will understood this completely. He would have done the same thing. If someone had something that belonged to him, the first thing he would watch is how they handled it. He reached out and rested one hand very lightly on top of the egg. Not gripping it. Not moving it. Just resting his hand there, the way you rest a hand on something you are keeping safe. The gold lines pulsed once under his palm, warm and steady. He heard a sound from the entrance. Low and quiet. Not the deep chest-filling sound from before. Something much smaller. Almost soft. Will did not look up immediately. He kept his hand on the egg and his eyes on the fire and waited a moment before turning his head. The creature's face was closer than before. It had moved its head forward, just inside the cave entrance, lowering it until the massive jaw was near the floor. The amber eyes were level with Will now rather than looking down at him. At this distance Will could see things he had not been able to see before. The scales around the face were not all the same color. Dark at the edges, lighter toward the center, with a faint iridescence that the firelight caught and turned briefly gold. The nostrils were wide and slow, breathing in long steady pulls. It was smelling the egg. Will stayed still. The creature's nose moved closer to the egg, slowly, with great care, as if it was aware of how large it was relative to everything else in the cave. It stopped about half a meter from the egg and breathed in deeply. The gold lines on the egg flared briefly, brighter than they had been in hours. The rocking stopped for a moment, then started again, stronger than before. The creature made that small soft sound again. And from inside the egg, muffled and faint but completely clear, something answered. Will felt the hair on his arms stand up. Not from fear. From something else entirely. He had no word for it. It was the feeling of witnessing something private and enormous at the same time. Something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with 2 living things finding each other across a distance that had been too wide for too long. The creature stayed with its head close to the egg for a long time. Will moved his hand away slowly and sat back against the wall to give them space. He fed the fire quietly and looked at the flames and let the moment be what it was without putting himself in the middle of it. Eventually the creature pulled its head back to the entrance. It settled again, lower than before, more relaxed. The rigid quality that had been in its body since it first appeared, that tightly controlled stillness of something ready to act at any moment, was gone. The amber eyes were still open and still watching Will, but the watching had changed. The sharp edge was out of it. Will noticed this and said nothing. He just kept feeding the fire. The night went on. Will dozed twice, brief shallow dips into sleep that lasted maybe 20 minutes each before the cold or the discomfort woke him. Each time he woke he checked the fire first, then the egg, then the entrance. Each time the amber eyes were open and watching. After the second time he woke, he found that the creature had shifted its body more fully into the cave entrance, filling the gap more completely, and the cold air coming in around it had reduced noticeably. It had moved to block the wind. Will sat with that for a moment. Then he fed the fire and settled back and closed his eyes again. When the light came, it came slowly, gray first at the edges of the cave entrance, then pale blue, then something warmer as whatever passed for a sun on this world began to climb. Will was awake when it happened, sitting against the cave wall with the egg resting warm on the blanket in front of him and the last of the fire burning quietly in the pit. He looked at the entrance. The amber eyes were open. They had been open all night. Every single time Will had woken, every time he had checked, they had been open. Watching. Not with suspicion anymore. Not with that sharp ready quality from the first hour. Just watching. Present. There. Will met the creature's gaze in the gray morning light. He did not look away. Neither did it. Between them the fire made its small sounds and the egg pulsed its slow gold light and the mountain outside was quiet for the first time since Will had come down on it. Something had passed between them in the night. Neither of them could have said exactly what it was. But it was there. The crack appeared just after sunrise. Will almost missed it. He was feeding the last pieces of wood into the fire, watching the flames take the fresh fuel, when a sound made him stop. Small and sharp like a single tap on glass. He set the wood down and looked at the egg. There it was. A thin line near the top of the shell, running about 3 centimeters across the dark green surface. The gold lines around it were blazing, brighter than Will had ever seen them, so bright that the light from them was visible even against the growing morning light coming in through the cave entrance. The crack was dark against the brightness, a clean split in the shell with something darker just visible underneath. Will leaned forward slightly. The egg was not rocking anymore. It had gone completely still. All that movement from the night before, all that pushing and pressing from inside had stopped. It was the stillness of something gathering itself, taking a breath before the next thing. A sound came from the entrance. Will looked up. The creature was awake and alert in a way that was completely different from the quiet watching of the night. The amber eyes were wide and fixed on the egg with an intensity that made the air in the cave feel different. The massive head had come forward again just inside the entrance, low to the ground. The nostrils were moving fast. The body at the entrance had gone rigid, not with threat this time but with something that Will recognized immediately. It was the same feeling he had in his own chest right now. Anticipation. The held breath before something important. Will sat very still and watched the egg. For about 2 minutes nothing happened. Then the crack moved. It extended slowly to the right, following one of the gold lines across the shell as if the line itself was showing it where to go. Then it turned and went downward. Then another crack appeared on the left side of the first one, branching off at an angle. The gold light at the edges of the cracks was intense now, almost white, flooding out through the splits in the shell and throwing small bright lines across the cave floor. A sound came from inside. Not the muffled sounds from before. This was clear and direct and present, a sharp repeated sound, insistent and strong. Whatever was inside was done waiting. Done pressing carefully. Done being patient. It was ready. Will heard the creature at the entrance make a low sound. Deep and quiet, a steady note that did not rise or fall. He did not know if it was something said or something felt. But it was continuous, a thread of sound that ran under everything else, and somehow Will understood that it was meant for the egg. Come out, it was saying. In whatever language that was. Come out. I am here. The top of the egg exploded. Not violently, but suddenly and completely. The whole upper section of the shell broke outward in 4 or 5 large pieces that fell away and landed on the silver blanket. Gold light poured out of the opening like something liquid. Will blinked against it. Then a head appeared. It came up slowly, pushing through the remaining shell at the top, and it was the most serious face Will had ever seen on something that had existed for less than 30 seconds. Dark green scales, slightly wet, catching the firelight. A small flat nose already pulling in deep steady breaths. A jaw that was set with a kind of determination that seemed too large for something so new. And eyes. Gold. Bright and clear and very much awake. Not the unfocused eyes of something newborn and confused. Eyes that were looking. Taking things in. Processing. The hatchling pushed its way up out of the broken shell and sat in the middle of the silver blanket surrounded by pieces of what had contained it a moment ago. It was about the size of a large cat. Its wings were folded tight against its back, still wet, not ready yet. Its tail curled around itself automatically, finding its own balance. It sat there and looked around the cave with complete seriousness. Will did not move. He barely breathed. The hatchling turned its head to the left. It looked at the cave wall. Then it looked at the fire. It considered the fire for a moment with those gold eyes, not afraid of it, just noting it, filing it away. Then it looked up at the cave ceiling. Then at the floor. Then it turned and looked at the cave entrance. At its mother. The creature made a sound. That same low continuous note, warm and deep. The hatchling listened to it. Will watched the small head tilt slightly to one side as it processed whatever was in that sound. The gold eyes moved over the enormous face at the entrance, taking in the amber eyes, the scales, the size. Will expected it to go to her. Every instinct said it would go to her. She was large and warm and she had been making that sound, that come to me sound, since before the shell broke. She was the obvious choice. The natural choice. Will was already shifting his weight carefully to the side to make sure he was not between them when the hatchling crossed the cave floor. The hatchling looked at its mother for a long moment. Then it turned away. It turned its head in a slow arc across the cave, gold eyes moving across everything, and then the arc stopped. It stopped when it reached Will. The small gold eyes found his face and stayed there. Will went completely still. The hatchling looked at him the way it had looked at the fire. Steady. Direct. Taking him in fully without hurry. It looked at his face and his hands and the emergency blanket under its own feet and the jacket that was still wrapped around the lower section of the broken shell. It looked at all of this with that same seriousness that seemed impossible for something so small and so new. Then it moved. It stepped forward off the broken shell onto the cave floor, forelegs finding their coordination quickly, tail lifting slightly for balance. It walked across the floor toward Will with a directness that left no room for interpretation. Will looked up at the entrance with wide eyes. The creature was absolutely still. The amber eyes had moved from the hatchling to Will's face. The expression, if it could be called that, was unreadable. Not angry. Not threatening. But very, very focused. Will looked back down at the hatchling which had now reached his feet. It stopped there and looked up at him from the floor. Close up the gold eyes were extraordinary. Deep and bright and full of something that had no right to be there and something that had been inside a shell 5 minutes ago. It looked up at him and made a sound. Small and clear and direct. Will had absolutely no idea what to do. He looked up at the entrance again. The amber eyes were still on him. He opened his hands slightly, showing them empty, a gesture he had used before in this cave and that had worked before in this cave. Then he looked at the hatchling and very slowly shook his head, trying to communicate something across a gap of biology and language and about 60 seconds of the hatchling's entire life. The hatchling ignored all of this completely. It put its front feet on Will's knee and pushed itself up and climbed into his lap with the focused efficiency of something that had already decided and was simply completing the action. It turned around once in his lap, tail swinging, and then sat down and folded its front feet under its chest and looked at the fire. It made a small satisfied sound. Will sat with his hands held out to the sides, not touching the hatchling, not moving at all, and looked at the entrance. The creature was staring at him. Will slowly mouthed 2 words. He did not know if expressions crossed between species, did not know if the creature had any framework for reading a human face, did not know anything useful at all in this moment. But he mouthed the words anyway. I'm sorry. He shook his head slowly, genuinely, with every honest feeling he had in him. I don't know why. The creature looked at him for a very long time. Then it made a sound that Will had not heard before. Not the deep stone and thunder sounds from the night before. Not the low continuous note it had been making for the hatchling. Something different. Shorter. With a shape to it that was almost like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Will did not know what it meant. But the amber eyes had changed again. That impossible-to-name quality that had been shifting all night had shifted one more time into something that Will, despite everything, despite the impossibility of reading the face of a creature he had never seen before on a mountain he had never been on, found that he recognized. It was the look of something that was going to have to accept something unexpected. The hatchling in Will's lap made another small sound and pressed its warm side more firmly against his stomach. Will very carefully lowered his hands. The rescue ship came on the 3rd day. Will heard it before he saw it. A low steady sound from somewhere above the clouds, the kind of sound that a person who has been alone on a frozen mountain for 3 days listens to with their whole body. He was sitting outside the cave entrance in the thin morning light with the hatchling on his knee when the sound reached him. He looked up at the white sky and let out a long slow breath that turned to mist in the cold air. The hatchling looked up too. It had been doing that since yesterday, copying the direction of Will's attention, looking at whatever he looked at. Will had noticed this and found it both remarkable and a little heavy, the weight of being the thing that a new creature was using to understand the world. He looked up at the ridge above the cave. Sora was there. That was the name Will had settled on inside his head 2 days ago, because his brain needed something to hold on to, and the sound her name actually made was not something his mouth could produce. She had been on the ridge since early morning, watching the sky with those amber eyes, her dark-scaled body very still against the white background. She had known before he did. She had probably known since last night. She looked down at him now. Will raised one hand. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the sky. The rescue ship broke through the clouds 10 minutes later. It came down slow and careful, reading the terrain, finding the flat shelf of rock about 200 meters down the slope that was the only reasonable place to land. Will watched it descend with the hatchling standing on his legs now, small claws pressing into his thighs, neck stretched upward watching the large thing come down from the sky. Will put a hand on the hatchling's back without thinking. The hatchling leaned into his hand without thinking. He noticed this a moment later and looked at his own hand resting on the small warm back and felt something move through him that he did not examine too closely. For people came out of the ship. They were in cold weather gear with the survey company insignia on the shoulders. 2 of them stopped when they saw Sora on the ridge. 1 of them took a step back toward the ship. The 4th one, a woman moving with the steady confidence of someone who had done difficult things in difficult places many times, kept walking toward Will. She stopped about 10 meters away. She looked at Will. Then at the hatchling on his lap. Then up at Sora on the ridge. Then back at Will. Will gave her a tired wave. She walked the rest of the way to him and crouched down to his level and looked at his face with the practical eyes of someone checking for damage. "You look terrible," she said. "I have been better," Will said. She looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back at her with gold eyes and made a small sound that Will had come to recognize as its version of "not sure about this yet." "That is not something I was expecting to see," she said. "That makes 2 of us," Will said. They got him inside the ship eventually. It took time because the hatchling did not want to leave his lap, and Sora came down from the ridge when they started moving, and the rescue team had a difficult 20 minutes working out how to proceed with a creature the size of a small building watching every step they took. But Sora did not come closer than 20 meters and she did not make any sound that felt like a threat, and eventually Will carried the hatchling into the ship and Sora settled on the rocks outside and waited. Inside the ship was warm and dry and had actual food. Will sat in the corner with the hatchling pressed against his side and ate the first real meal he had eaten in 3 days and said very little. The team lead asked him questions and he answered them honestly and completely. What happened to the ship? Where he had come down? How he had found the cave? How he had found the egg? He told all of it plainly. The team lead wrote things down and asked follow-up questions and did not seem to know what to do with most of his answers. Will did not blame her. By afternoon a second ship had arrived. This one was larger and carried different people. People with equipment cases and communication gear and a tall thin man named something Will immediately forgot who turned out to be a xenolinguist, which meant his entire job was learning to talk to species that humans had never talked to before. He had a small device on a strap around his neck that he adjusted constantly and he looked at Sora outside with the expression of someone who had waited their whole career for exactly this moment. It took 2 days. Will stayed because nobody suggested he leave and because the hatchling, which the xenolinguist had taken to calling the hatchling in his notes but which Will had privately started calling Pip because of the small sounds it made, refused to go more than 3 meters from Will at any point. Sora permitted this with a patience that Will found remarkable and somewhat humbling. She watched from nearby, always nearby, amber eyes moving between the hatchling and Will with a regularity that felt like checking, like making sure the thing she was watching was still true. On the morning of the second day the xenolinguist came to Will with his device and a careful expression. "I think we can try," he said. They sat outside in the cold, Will and the xenolinguist and Sora, with Pip pressed against Will's leg and the device between them making small sounds as it processed. Sora spoke first. Long and low, the sounds rolling out across the cold air with a weight and rhythm that Will had spent 3 days listening to without understanding. The device worked for a moment. Then a voice came out of it. Flat and mechanical, not Sora's voice, nothing like Sora's voice, but carrying the shape of what she had said. The words were a question. "Why did you not leave the egg?" Will looked at Sora. She was watching him with those amber eyes, steady and direct, the same way she had watched him across the fire on the first night. Waiting for the real answer. Not the easy one. Not the practical one. The one underneath. Will thought about it for a moment. He thought about standing on the frozen slope with the cold eating through his jacket and 3 hours of light left and a broken radio and no shelter and hearing that thin tired sound coming from behind the rocks. He thought about the moment he turned toward it instead of away. He had not reasoned his way to that decision. He had not weighed options or calculated risks. He had just turned. He looked at Sora. "It was scared," he said. I could hear it. It had been alone for a long time and it was running out of strength and it was scared. He paused. I couldn't just walk past that. The device translated. Sora was quiet. Not the considering quiet of someone thinking about what to say next. A deeper quiet. The kind that meant something had landed and needed a moment before anything else could happen. Her amber eyes stayed on Will's face and Will did not look away. Pip made a small sound against his leg. Will put his hand on the small warm head without looking down. Sora watched this. Then she spoke again. Slow and deliberate, choosing each sound with care, as if she was carrying something fragile and wanted to set it down without breaking it. The device processed. My child felt your choice before it was born. It felt you turn toward it when you did not have to. It felt you carry it when carrying it cost you something. Among my kind there is a word for the one a hatchling chooses at birth. It is the oldest word we have. It means the one who turned toward. Will sat with that. We call that one family, the device said. Will looked down at Pip. Pip looked up at him with gold eyes and made the small sound that Will had learned over 3 days meant something close to I am here and you are here and that is correct. Will looked back at Sora. I am a survey pilot, he said. I fly alone. I live in a small apartment. I do not even own a plant. The device translated. Something happened in Sora's face. It moved in a way that Will had not seen before, a shift around the eyes and the line of the jaw, and it took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. She was doing something like smiling. She spoke again and the device translated without pause. You turned toward a frightened thing in the cold when it cost you something to do so. What you own or do not own is not the point. The point is what you did. Will looked at Pip again. Pip had curled itself around his hand and was pressing its warm head into his palm with its eyes closed. 3 days old and already completely certain about something that Will was still catching up to. Will sat on the cold rock on a frozen mountain far from home with a dragon hatchling asleep in his hands and the hatchling's mother watching him with ancient amber eyes and the thin mountain wind moving past all of them. He looked at Sora. Okay, he said quietly. Family. Sora held his gaze for a long moment. Then she lowered her great head slowly, all the way down until it rested near the ground, a movement so deliberate and so complete that even without a translator Will understood exactly what it meant. He bowed his head back. Pip slept on, warm and certain, dreaming whatever new things dream about. And on a mountain that had tried its best to kill him, Will smiled for the first time in days.